John Wayne publicly dismissed the new generation of troublemaking rebels as mere actors playing dress-up in his domain. The Duke had built Hollywood's vision of the American West through 3 decades of commanding screen presence. And he wasn't about to hand over authority to motorcycle-riding upstarts who confused rebellion with authenticity. Then he met Steve McQueen in private on a dusty Warner Brothers backlot and saw the same grit that built the Old West. The desert wind suddenly carried the scent of changing times. If you respect the real Steve McQueen, subscribe to Steve McQueen Untold Legacy. April 1969. Warner Brothers backlot, where the studio's elaborate western town set stretched across 2 acres of carefully constructed frontier atmosphere. Evening light painted everything in shades of gold and copper that made artificial buildings look genuinely historic, shadows growing longer as the California sun descended toward the horizon. The air carried dust kicked up by day-long filming, mixed with the scent of leather equipment and the kind of masculine tension that came when different generations of Hollywood talent occupied the same territory. John Wayne, 62 years old, emerged from the saloon facade with the measured stride that had defined American heroism for 3 decades. Fresh from completing another day of filming True Grit, the Western that would finally earn him the Academy Award recognition that had eluded him despite iconic performances that had shaped the genre. Wearing authentic period costume that somehow looked more natural on him than modern clothes, he moved through the artificial frontier town like he owned every building and knew every resident personally. His presence filled space with authority that came from more than physical size or screen reputation. This was a man who'd created the template that every other Western actor measured himself against, who'd defined what American masculinity looked like to audiences worldwide. The kind of established power that younger performers either respected or challenged, but could never ignore. Steve McQueen, 39 years old, sat astride his motorcycle at the edge of the set, like a visitor from a different era who'd accidentally wandered into the wrong century. Still wearing the sweat-stained work clothes from his own day of filming, he'd removed his helmet to reveal hair dampened by honest exertion, rather than studio makeup department preparation. His pale blue eyes studied Wayne with the analytical attention he applied to everything involving authority, competition, or the relationship between reputation and authentic capability. The contrast was immediate and striking. Wayne represented the classical Hollywood tradition where stars were larger-than-life figures who inspired audiences through superior presence and unshakable moral authority. McQueen represented something newer and more complicated. Stars who connected with audiences through shared struggle rather than admired superiority. Both men understood that this encounter was about more than casual conversation between colleagues. Wayne had been publicly critical of newer actors who brought what he considered inappropriate rebelliousness to roles that required clear moral authority. McQueen had privately expressed skepticism about older performers who relied on established formulas rather than authentic character development. "Young man," Wayne called out, his voice carrying the same commanding projection that had made him famous before sound recording technology required subtlety. "You're on the lot late for someone whose shooting day should have ended hours ago. Staying late to get things right, Mr. Wayne, same as you. That's admirable. Though I've noticed your generation tends to confuse working hard with working authentically." The observation was delivered without obvious hostility, but carried implications that McQueen understood immediately. Wayne was suggesting that modern actors prioritized effort over understanding, technique over character, innovation over proven methods that had served the industry effectively for decades. "How do you mean?" Wayne walked closer, his movements creating subtle shift in the dynamic between them. Where McQueen's presence suggested coiled energy ready to explode into action, Wayne's presence suggested immovable stability that had weathered every challenge and remained fundamentally unchanged. "I mean that acting tough and being tough are different things, son. Your generation seems to think that looking rebellious is the same as having something worth rebelling for. And you think we don't? I think most of you are playing characters without understanding what those characters represent or where they come from." McQueen dismounted from his motorcycle. with movements that carried none of Wayne's theatrical awareness, but somehow suggested equal capability through completely different means. Where Wayne's actions looked like they belonged in epic productions, McQueen's looked like they belonged in real situations that required practical solutions rather than heroic gestures. "Mr. Wayne, can I ask you something?" "Certainly. When you play Western characters, what are you representing?" Wayne considered the question with a seriousness he applied to all discussions about the craft that had defined his career. "I'm representing men who built civilization out of wilderness through moral courage and physical capability. Men who understood that some things are worth fighting for regardless of personal cost." "That's admirable, really. But can I ask, what gives you the authority to represent those men?" The question hung in the evening air like gun smoke, revealing that McQueen was challenging not Wayne's talent or reputation, but the authenticity of his connection to the characters he portrayed. This wasn't about acting technique. This was about life experience. "What do you mean by that, son?" "I mean, have you ever been in situations where moral courage and physical capability were the only things standing between you and permanent failure?" Wayne studied McQueen with new attention, understanding that the younger actor was describing something more personal than professional philosophy. "Are you suggesting that my approach to Western characters lacks authenticity because I haven't lived their exact experiences?" "I'm asking whether playing tough characters and being a tough person are different things, and if so, which one serves audiences better." "And you think you know the answer to that question?" McQueen rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms scarred by motorcycle accidents, factory work, and the kind of physical labor that most actors avoided through stunt doubles and careful scheduling. "Not dramatically or theatrically, just matter-of-factly, like showing identification when questioned by authorities. I know what it feels like to wake up in places where nobody cares whether you live or die. I know what it feels like to handle dangerous equipment when failure means serious injury. I know what it feels like to make decisions when all the options are bad, but doing nothing is worse." Wayne examined those scars with the attention of someone who'd learned to evaluate men through evidence rather than claims. Understanding that McQueen was revealing something that went beyond professional preparation to authentic life experience. Reform school? Boys' Republic, military service. Motorcycle racing, factory work before Hollywood. Situations where technique matters less than commitment and style matters less than results. "And you think that background gives you advantages over actors who learned their craft through traditional training?" "I think it gives me different tools for different kinds of roles. Your characters inspire people to believe in moral authority and clear choices between right and wrong. My characters help people survive situations where moral authority doesn't exist, and all choices involve some kind of compromise." Wayne nodded with understanding that came from decades of working with actors who brought different backgrounds to similar challenges. Different kinds of authenticity for different kinds of storytelling. Both necessary for complete understanding of what the West actually was and what it means to modern audiences. The conversation was interrupted by wind that kicked dust across the artificial town, creating atmosphere that looked more authentic than any studio special effects department could manufacture. Both men understanding that they were examining fundamental questions about performance, authenticity, and the relationship between personal experience and professional capability. "Steve," Wayne said, using the younger actor's first name for the first time, "show me your quick-draw technique." The request was delivered casually, but McQueen understood that he was being tested according to standards that Wayne had developed through years of working with the finest weapons masters and technical advisors in the industry. "Don't carry a weapon, Mr. Wayne, not part of my usual equipment." Wayne unholstered his own Colt .45, checking the cylinder to ensure it was unloaded before extending it toward McQueen. "Use mine. Let's see what all that authentic life experience produces when applied to traditional Western skills." McQueen accepted the weapon with movements that revealed immediate familiarity with firearms that went beyond professional training. Not the studied competence of an actor who'd learned to handle props, but the natural ease of someone who'd used similar tools for practical purposes rather than entertainment requirements. He positioned himself facing one of the hitching posts that served as impromptu target, but his stance carried none of Wayne's classical positioning or theatrical awareness, just functional readiness that somehow suggested more immediate danger than elaborate preparation. Different approach to the same challenge, Wayne observed. Different purpose for the same tools. McQueen drew the weapon with movement that challenged every assumption about the relationship between training and capability. No balletic grace or studied precision, just explosive efficiency that made Wayne's classical technique look like performance art rather than practical skill. The draw was completed before Wayne could analyze its mechanical elements, speed that served purposes beyond demonstration or entertainment. McQueen dry-fired the weapon at his selected target, the click echoing across the backlot with authority that suggested real violence rather than movie magic. "Jesus," Wayne whispered. McQueen returned the Colt with the same casual competence he'd shown while using it. Different tools for different situations. "Your technique inspires confidence in characters who lead through moral authority. Mine serves characters who survive through practical capability. Both necessary for complete understanding of what heroism actually requires. Both authentic for different kinds of men facing different kinds of challenges." Wayne studied McQueen with expression that mixed professional respect with something that looked like recognition. Understanding that he'd encountered someone who represented not opposition to traditional values, but evolution of those values through different circumstances and different necessities. "Steve, can I tell you something?" "Sure." "When I first saw your work, I thought you represented everything wrong with the new generation of actors. Rebellion without purpose. Toughness without foundation, style without substance. And now?" Wayne placed his hand on McQueen's shoulder with gesture that carried weight beyond simple friendliness. This was acknowledgement between professionals who'd tested each other and discovered mutual respect, despite fundamental differences in background and approach. "Now I understand that you're not rebelling against what we built. You're continuing it under conditions we never had to face." "How so?" "Because the world has changed since we established the Western genre. Modern audiences need heroes who can handle moral ambiguity and complex choices, not just clear battles between good and evil. Your characters serve that need. And your characters provide the foundation that makes our complexity meaningful instead of just cynical. Both necessary for keeping the genre relevant to audiences who live in different circumstances than the ones that created our original stories." The evening light was fading toward darkness that would end outdoor conversation, but both men understood that their encounter had established something more valuable than professional courtesy. They'd discovered that different generations could serve the same fundamental purposes through different methods, that authenticity came in various forms that could coexist rather than compete. "Mr. Wayne," McQueen said as they prepared to leave the backlot, "I want you to know that everything I've learned about screen presence, I learned by studying your work. And everything I'm learning about reaching modern audiences, I'm learning by watching yours. Different approaches to the same goals. Different solutions to the same fundamental challenge of making audiences believe that the characters they're watching could handle whatever situations the stories demand." As Wayne walked toward the studio exit, his stride carried the same authority that had characterized his arrival, but something had shifted in his understanding of what that authority meant and how it could be continued rather than simply preserved. McQueen remained beside his motorcycle, watching the older actor disappear into shadows that seemed less threatening and more protective than they had earlier. Understanding that he'd received something more valuable than approval, he'd earned recognition from someone whose respect was worth having. The desert wind continued to blow across artificial frontier that had served as testing ground for authentic character, proving that some conversations change how people understand themselves and their place in larger stories about courage, authenticity, and the different ways men could honor the same fundamental values. John Wayne publicly dismissed the new generation of troublemaking rebels until he met Steve McQueen in private and saw the same grit that built the Old West. Subscribe to Steve McQueen Untold Legacy for stories they never told you.